So, welcome to the School of Disability Studies public lecture with Dr. Rashmee Karnad-Jani. And we're so happy to have you here, Dr. Karnad-Jani, for your talk, How EAs Stand with Disabled Students and Their Families. Sorry, I'll repeat the title again, Ruling Relations and Invisibilized Solidarities, How EAs Stand with Disabled Students and Their Families. My name is Eliza Chandler, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Disability Studies. By way of image description, I am a noticeably disabled, white, cisgendered woman. I have short hair, black glasses, and I'm wearing a dark top and jacket. As we gather here tonight with Dr. Karnad-Jani, we gather from a diverse set of territories. I'm speaking to you from my home in Toronto, which is on Treaty 13 territory, a treaty that was established between the Mississauga of the Credit River and the British Crown. We are surrounded by Treaty 13A, Treaty 20, also known as the Williams Treaty, and Treaty 19. I would like to welcome you on the behalf of the School of Disability Studies, which has been providing internationally renowned teaching and research in critical disability and math studies for over 20 years. A part-time undergraduate degree completion program, we are privileged to be engaging primarily with working students whose lives intersect with disability, madness, and deafhood as workers, family members, or through direct experience. I'd like to give a warm welcome to folks who are here because they are interested in becoming a disability studies student, and of course, the students of DST 613 who have opened up their final class to hosting this talk. Our access tonight is supported by the Faculty of Community Services, who continue to provide access, allowing our school to continue our work with disability, deaf, and mad communities. We have ASL interpretation from Roman Fisichella and hopefully Debbie Parliament in a little while, and captions are provided by AI Media. If you would like to see live captions, please click the CC button. Please note, as I've said, that we are recording. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our esteemed colleague and guest tonight, Dr. Rashmee Karnad-Jani. Dr. Rashmee Karnad-Jani is a kindergarten to grade 12 special education consultant in a publicly funded school board in the Greater Toronto Area. Her doctoral research invisibilized work in hidden labor in Ontario's public education, a decolonizing institutional ethnography of mothering and teachers' work was defended at the University of Toronto's Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. For her doctoral work, Rashmee specialized in educational leadership and policy research at OISE U of T. Rashmee is interested in how educational policy gets taken up in local work sites such as schools and classrooms. She examines policy implication gaps by mapping the gendered work of women mothering work, following the scholarship of Alison Griffith and Dorothy Smith, and I believe we are fortunate to have Dorothy Smith here with us tonight, and to examine the ways in which the Ontario's parent engagement policy is organized. As I mentioned, this talk is part of a course at the School of Disability Studies, Strategies for Community Building. In this course, we talk about how when we are working for social change, it is important to build solidarity with the people or groups who are not necessarily part of our communities, but who are in their own way affected by the issues that we are fighting for or against. Many of our students are educational assistants, EAs, and so I've invited Rashmee to speak specifically about her research in the context of building solidarity between EAs and the disabled students they support and their families as a way of addressing ableism and racism in schools. Dr. Rashmee and I will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have time for discussion. In the meantime, whenever the moment strikes you, please feel free to write a question for Rashmee in the chat, and we will collect them and ask them and engage them in discussion at the end. In the interest of time and to respect our wonderful access workers and all of you, we will end the discussion at 7:25, which will likely be far too soon, but we will take that as an invitation for more an extended conversation with Dr. Rashmee in the future. I'm sure this is the beginning of a wonderful collegiality between our school and Dr. Rashmee. So that is what I got to say by way of access, land acknowledgement, and introduction. So now I would really just love to have a conversation with you, Rashmee. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. I can tell by the attendance that there's so many people here eager to hear from you. So I'll just start by asking you an open question, which is to talk to us a little bit about your PhD research and what brought you to this research topic. And perhaps within that question, one of the concepts we've been talking about in our class is how the personal is political. So perhaps you could talk about your own situatedness in that project. And I'm happy to share my screen whenever you would like.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for this opportunity to connect with so many members of the community. In 2019, when I submitted my research proposal for ethics clearance at OISE, I had written in that I would be disseminating my findings and my recommendations in the communities where this work gets done. And at that time, I had no idea that this day was possible. So thank you so much. So to answer your question then, a little background here. Our family of 4 had arrived in Ontario in the GTA in 2002 when my children were 3 and 7. And I already had life and work experiences from other places as we had lived and worked in Mumbai, Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, Dhaka in Bangladesh for a short while, and Singapore prior to moving here. From the last week of January of 2002, when my daughter entered grade 2, I had begun to experience Ontario schooling myself and through her. These experiences were not always pleasant and were sometimes quite unpleasant, although we had come here after hearing about Ontario's excellent education system through the immigration pipeline. I began to volunteer in my daughter's school with primary grades, as I had heard that that would help me familiarize with educational spaces here. I had not yet thought of becoming a teacher. In March and April that year, there was a new vice principal at the school, and I went to meet her as I had read the announcement in the newsletter. Mrs. H welcomed me into her office and invited me for a chat. That was the day the caretakers were hanging up her certificates on her walls, and as we sat there and talked, she mentioned her trajectory and asked about mine, until that moment together. When she heard I had a degree in science, she suggested that I consider doing my B.Ed. And she connected me to a recently hired teacher who helped me think through how to apply to the Faculty of Education. Mrs. H also invited me to set up the South Asian Heritage Month display that May. And when she asked me to do so, I did not know what that meant. Because while I did know from my husband's corporate career in Asia that South Asia was a business term for that section of the market, I did not know that I was being seen as South Asian in this new place. I just knew how to be me until that point. And I slowly began to realize from then on that I was being seen as part of a massive humanity that was being named in the same way as corporate markets were named in my prior knowledge. I attended York University's open house, where we were encouraged by a wonderful presenter to apply and not worry about who else is applying, which made a huge difference. I had, of course, to prove my English language proficiency, and because U of T found some issue with my results then, and York granted me an interview, I got admission into the Math, Science, and Tech B.Ed program in 2003. In 2004, I got hired to teach grade 7 science. What is not visible in this short background is the saga of texts that internationally trained professionals sometimes know all too well. But that would take up a lot more time than we have today, and I'm co-writing a paper about that soon, so we will talk about that a little bit later. So about my research, I follow a method of inquiry called institutional ethnography that was developed by Dr. Dorothy Smith, who is with us here today on the call. So Dr. Chandler, if you could please share the first visual of the small hero. Then I can explain from there. Thank you. So here, my research, so this diagram here is the small hero, as Dorothy Smith spoke about the figure. And towering over the figure, the small hero, are many shapes. And one of them is work organization of mothering and teaching. Interlocked with that is the single parent and the professional discourse. To the right is the political and bureaucratic organization of education. And right at the top is the state. A little bit to the side, to the left of the small hero, is class. So Dorothy Smith took up social class in her work. It's very ambitious of me to try and talk about all the work that has been done for the last 4 decades by Dr. Smith. So I will keep this diagram in your thoughts and proceed with my conversation. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Ref. Could I ask you the next question?
Yes, you had asked me about the personal being political.
Okay, great.
May I answer that?
Yes, thank you.
I wanted to situate the diagram of the small hero because the small hero is extremely important in terms of the governance mechanism hovering over and being over the head of the small hero. So that was the reason I wanted to bring that forward. So in terms of the personal being political, I wanted to share how once I started working in the school, I didn't realize for a long time that I was immersed in the space where the disjunctures were happening in terms of what was written and what was being experienced by people. And it's only in about 2011 or 2010 when my daughter was growing up to be in grade 8 or so, and I was teaching grade 7 and 8 as a special education teacher, I began to realize that the questions my students' mothers were asking were different from the questions I had. And I seemed to just know what to do. And like most aspects of privilege, until that point, I hadn't realized the institutional privilege I had because I was immersed in the work. So my work knowledge was showing me what to do for my daughter's transition to and through high school. And my students' mothers had questions for me that did not align with what I knew from my expert knowledge. That was the time I was taking courses with Alison Griffith, who is Dorothy Smith's co-author for Mothering for Schooling. And we talked about this work a little bit. And she said, "Are you noticing something?" And I said, "Yes, I'm noticing that there is this course selection booklet and there is a lot of information, but how is it that I get it so quickly?" And at that time, I was able to realize the difference of positionality in the work knowledge, because of which I was able to understand. And I think it began from a point of saying what I can get for my students, for my children. I also wanted my students and their mothers to have that. So that's when the personal became political, because these women who looked like me and talked like me did not have the same access points that I had.
Thank you so much. I guess building off of that question, Rashmee, you set us up so nicely to speak about, to think about the different ways that we have access to education. Could you speak a little bit about how, from your various positionalities as an activist, as an immigrant, as a parent, and someone working in the school, as well as based on your own research, how do you understand EAs, disabled students, and their families as situated in relation to hegemonic powers in school? And perhaps drawing on what you just said, if you could give us some examples of how institutional ethnography, getting to know the ruling relations, the ruling power relations within the school, might help us build solidarity between these different positions: EAs, disabled students, parents, mothers.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of power. So there's one aspect of power which is positional, which comes to us from our work designations. And that says, this is your accountability in the organization, this is your role, therefore this is the power ascribed to you within your institutional role. And the other aspect of it is the personal power that we have, which is within us. Now, ruling relations, as you brought it up, and it's there as a hashtag in my Twitter handle also, is an explanation that Dorothy Smith has given in terms of ruling relations is the complex of objectified social relations that organize and regulate our lives in contemporary society. Now, let's think of it this way. Decisions that are made in the governance mechanism far away from where we are and where we do our everyday work, those trickle into our lives and they hook us into these particular ways of doing our work. So we understand our work as our paid employment is different from the work that we do. In institutional ethnography, work is something that is intentionally done, takes effort, and is expected to produce results, and is different from paid employment, which is given to us within our institutional roles. So in terms of your question about education assistants working with students, the knowledge that our support educators have of their students is a very close knowledge. is a very embodied knowledge. You know what students are doing with their bodies. This work is getting done by you within your bodies. You are interacting very closely with students. And in doing that, there is a connection between the work that gets done in school and the work that gets done in homes. For example, let's say a student comes back after a long break and they need to be familiarized with their routines again. Things impact the work that support educators do in the classroom based on the family's work that was supplementing the work that is done in school. So the family-school connection becomes very visible in the work that you have to do every time along with students. One thing that is not present in the educational assistant's role is you do not write institutional texts. For example, you may give input for a report card, you may give input for an IEP, but it is not the institutional responsibility assigned to support educators to write that report card or to write that IEP necessarily. That role is given to the teacher in the team. So therefore, sometimes my research is not really, I have not done my research with education assistants, but in order to make this point clearer, I wanted to talk about the work that teachers do and what they experienced in the data that I gathered from them. And then I will come back to this question. Is that okay? So some of the things that teachers talked about in the data in my research was they spoke about the maximum tensions in their work coming out of their interactions with other teachers. So they talked about things like when they saw a student's accommodations were not being met, they were extremely uncomfortable with interacting with their colleagues in order to bring this matter forward. Or if they noticed that their student was not able to self-regulate in an integrated setting when the student was in another classroom, they did not feel comfortable to bring up this point with their colleagues. And what came up over and over for teachers, and they spoke about it, was that's not my place. Or I don't want to get in trouble. Or they spoke about, I can't talk about somebody else's professional judgment. So although my research was not with education assistants, I am looking at that data that I gathered and bringing it into this conversation to notice to invite you to notice what perhaps happens in your work when you are with other colleagues in other classrooms, when your advocacy practices come face to face with institutional power. When you are doing your advocacy for the student based on your understanding of human rights, of ableism, but you come face to face with institutional power, which is vested in that colleague's presence in your space. So in terms of hegemony, I suppose we are looking at the definition as a form of control exercised by a dominant class that Gramsci talks about. But here, it is an institutional hierarchy that is putting people in a different space and saying one job or one role has more power than another.
Speaking to that point of power, Rashmi, A lot of times our students, and I invite our students to be asking questions as well, related to your own situatedness. Draw out or describe instances of inequity, racism, and ableism that they experience as EAs who are working in a system in which hegemonic power circulates. And they also have power in these positions. So they are under power and they have power. And a lot of times, what they describe in our classes and things like this is an alliance or a possibility to build solidarity with students who are also similarly impacted by hegemonic power. And so instances like not being listened to in meetings and things like that, and might we think about that experience as somehow related to the experience of a disabled child not being listened to in class, or a disabled parent, a parent of a disabled child not being listened to in a meeting or something like that. And given these shared experiences, I wonder if you might give us some of your thoughts or some of your findings about possibilities of building solidarity around these different but related situatedness, situated experiences. And along with that, I wonder if there's possibility for parents and EAs to work together to teach disabled children self-advocacy, tools for self-advocacy, so that as they grow up and they enter into different kinds of spaces and accrue different kinds of power, that they too can participate in self-advocacy on their own behalf.
Thank you for that question. So I was thinking about the intersections, the various things that happen, and how a person's experience can be complicated further when discrimination based on a disability intersects with other discriminations, such as race, sex, sexual orientation, age, or linguistic fluencies as well, which make people through a misunderstanding of common sense sexism and racism think about people being less than. And people with disabilities are also experiencing this along with their families and the people who advocate for them. So in schooling, this description of an ideological code that Dorothy Smith brought up comes in very handy, or it is a very good way of looking at what happens in conversations and in spaces. In 1987 and 1993, Dorothy Smith talked about SNAF, or the Standard North American Family. And the Standard North American Family is an ideological code through which families are sorted. And we don't even realize that. Families are sorted with a norm of a middle-class heterosexual family wherein the father is the one who is going out and earning money and making enough that allows the mother to be able to devote her time to the schooling and educational outcomes of the children. And Griffith and Smith talked about how the amount of unpaid work time that is available to the person doing the gendered labor has an impact on the school outcomes of that child. So in my work, I have talked about when people say an IEP is an equity tool, it's an incomplete sentence. An individual education plan is an equity tool when it is taken up from the point of equity, you see? So in order for the solidarities to happen, I would invite EAs and support educators to notice their institutional location in addition to their racial linguistic privilege that automatically places them sometimes at a higher level than parents of disabled children whose racial, linguistic, and socioeconomic locations place them below the institutional insiders. If we begin to notice that, we can come to a point that Smith calls change from below, because we begin to notice our own privilege and we say, wait a minute, I'm able to advocate for this for people in my life because I have this, this, and this at my disposal. And I am talking to people, I'm looking at them as objects, or I'm objectifying them in what they do. But if I look at why they're doing what they're doing in the material conditions they have and the social relations that they have, then that institutional relation begins to come into view. So in my PhD, I talked about something called the blended standpoint. And in the blended standpoint, I talk about how, and that's in my conceptual framework as well, which you can show the visual later, where the small hero is standing and looking up at the institutional complex. If support educators stand beside that small hero, who is the parent or the student, and begin to notice what it is that they are noticing and what they are experiencing in their embodied presence, then that understanding is how our advocacy has to be intertwined in order for it to work. Because parents don't always sit in on all meetings. All parents don't get invited to all meetings. All students don't get invited to all meetings. Our non-speaking students don't get invited to speak always about what they want. Also, our support educators do not have preps, do not have release time to attend meetings. So those casual conversations in hallways or when people visit the classroom as experts becomes a point where our support educators can influence the narrative about that student. Because talk is what is called discourse, right? It becomes the story of that student. So how that talk becomes a text is important to notice, because nothing we say stays as words in space in that interaction. Parents may trust us with information, but someone is writing it down. And that someone is usually creating a text which goes somewhere and informs an action which goes somewhere. And what happens then is all these texts layer up and become the story of that child, of that student. So being mindful of what we talk about, or when we are invited into conversations, even saying something like, that hasn't been my experience. I know this student is very capable because, and inviting them in, which I call holding the door open from the inside, I think allows people to speak for themselves and not have us speak for them. We can speak of them and then open that door, because we do have insider institutional privilege as support educators and all of us working within the system.
Yeah, thank you for that. I really appreciate how you're enlivening Smith's model of institutional ethnography to give us really practical ways of attending to the relations of ruling, and how people in diverse positions, both at school, perhaps can occupy these positions in very specific ways depending on race, class, linguistic privileges, as you've been saying. In the chat, there's a bit of discussion amongst some EAs in our program, which is really great to see. So maybe I'll just try my best to summarize what is being said. So one of our students, Sandra Leach, is talking about, and Sandra, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you are an EA yourself, working as an EA. So wondering about the conversations that EAs get invited into, and how this working with students gets acknowledged as expertise that both the EAs have over the lived experience of disabled students. And Amanda McBain has also said EAs often don't get invited to all of the meetings. And Rebecca has also said, I am an EA, and as such, it is my role to implement and support the planning and programming for the students I work with. As Dr. Karnad shares, the students are the responsibility of the teacher to be able to report on and program for. It is important for them to take responsibility for student needs. As you alluded to, the EAs are generally the ones who spend most time with the students, though. So these are really great sort of on-the-ground reflections of working with disabled students as EAs. And Lauren McNorrow, a faculty member in the School of Disability Studies who actually teaches our methodology course, has said holding the door open from the inside is such a great way of putting it. Thanks for that, Rashmee. So I'd invite you to sort of talk about any or all of these comments, Rashmee, but a common thread that I see between these comments is maybe even sort of unexpected moments in which we have the opportunity to hold the door open from the inside, and how we might sort of begin to take a critical perspective of the institution and identify possibilities for doing just that. Given that, as so many people are saying, they may not be invited into these formalized spaces of giving feedback or contributing to, as you say, the text of the institution. But even in your example of what is said during encounters as contributing to these institutional texts are perhaps subversive ways that students that EAs can take up space and articulate their own intimate knowledge of these students. So I suppose my question, and I'm talking my way through it, might be how might or what do your findings tell us about how people who are often outside of these meetings might take opportunities to influence discourse in text and practice?
Thank you for that question. I'm also looking at a comment or a curiosity question here from one of the participants. Why are we talking to teachers about the work being done with the students when that is the role of the EA? Did you get a chance to speak with EAs directly? So my response to that is, I have not had a chance to talk to EAs directly as a researcher. And it is one of my areas of interest that I would definitely like to have in-depth interviews and do the work with support educators to talk about what your experiences are within this work that you do. So that is something I am thinking about. But since I'm not affiliated to a university at this point, and I do not have the same options to engage in that research, but I'm a huge dreamer, and I'm extremely excited about the possibility of doing community-based research with colleagues who would be interested to participate. So maybe this is a start of a conversation. And oftentimes, yes, when experts visit the classroom, like occupational therapists or speech and language pathologists, the conversation goes directly to the person whose credentials say Ontario College of Teachers, right? And it's a matter of moving out of the way and saying, I invite my colleague to join me as well. And that is very dependent on the person in the classroom. And it can vary, as we know, from classroom to classroom. Now, I have been very fortunate to have worked in the company of 3 amazing colleagues in a school where the sunrises are always beautiful. And I began my work with them in 2015, and I learned so much from them that there were always 4 chairs and 4 experts in the room. It was never 1 plus 3. But I know that that is not available to everyone, and there is the work that we need to do. So in terms of how can we think critically about what needs to be done, I want to go to the work that I did with mothers. And in my data, what I found was that teacher mothers did their mothering work based on their expert knowledge because they knew what the curriculum was bringing for their child this year and next year. And non-educator mothers did their work depending on teachers to tell them what needed to be done. And if teachers did not tell them promptly or did not tell them in ways that they needed to hear it, they spent time, effort, and money in order to get results, which in institutional ethnography we call work or mothering work for schooling, in order to try and meet what they thought the teachers wanted them to do. Now, educator mothers had no such problem because they were not dependent on teachers at all. Like one of the mothers in my study, who was a vice principal, said, "Oh, I don't need to ask anyone what my son is going to learn that year. The long range plans are in the principal's office anyway. I just need to go in and ask." Because this vice principal mother and the principal of her child's school were colleagues, you see? So that is not available to everybody. Now, one point I wrote about in my doctoral dissertation was called Mothers and Teachers, Two Sides of the Same Coin. And I put a question mark there because that's how we are portrayed, that mothers and teachers are 2 sides of the same coin and they're not on the same side. And I wrote a piece for the Elementary Teachers Federation of Ontario by the same title, wherein I've encouraged teachers to say, you know how you advocate for your child or the children in your life for whom you are an aunt or a friend to their mother or however. How about you stand with, and now I've not written about it yet, but I call it share your playbook. Share with others what's working for you. So in terms of support educators, it becomes I'm going to talk to the family about what's working in the classroom, but in a very informal way. Until the power structure changes, these robust partnerships will still be happening based on individual initiative in pockets, you see? So that institutional framework of hegemony embedded in it needs to be teased apart. And that's why the research with people on the ground is extremely important to build change from the ground up.
Thank you, Rashmee. There's a lot of questions in the chat, which is fantastic to see. I invite you, Rashmee, to answer what you like, but I'll also read out some, and there's some thank yous. One that I noticed that I thought was really interesting was asked by a student in our program, Ty Hoot, and Ty asks, "How do you hold the door open for students who are nonverbal?" Has that come up in your experience or your research? To think, and maybe we can even think more broadly. I think the specificity of Ty's comment is quite important. So to be thinking about students who aren't able to to articulate in a way that those in power will attend to carefully.
I think those with power who define communication as only the way they understand needs to be reframed, and people need to learn that there are different ways in which students communicate. And people closest to them often know what students are communicating. And we need to, and there's enough room to do that, right? Because communication doesn't have to be verbal alone. At the same time, it's also important to notice amongst our student population who need assistive technology in order to communicate in the way that others can understand, we also need to begin to notice which are the students who are getting access to these devices quicker than others and why. Right? Who is the driving gear in that conversation of referrals within the system? Who is making things happen for that student quicker? We talk about family partnerships, but someone brought this to our conversation once a few weeks ago and says, what happens with students in group homes when I, as the EA, am the only one on his team, right? So then we need to, as institutional insiders, take up that responsibility equitably without waiting for people to ask. Because that is true inclusion. That is true universal design for learning, within which we also need to intentionally have an understanding of racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, and we cannot have only colleagues who are members of particular groups to do the heavy lifting, right? We need to do that also. Our racial literacy needs to improve in order to see who are we looking at with more scrutiny for behavior? Who are we disciplining disproportionately, or who are we disciplining at all, right? And then Foucault comes into view about the role of schools and discipline and punish, right? So all those aspects need to be taken into account, and people with power need to learn different ways that students communicate, because that is the social model, right? We cannot go back to the medical model of saying we need to fix the individual. We need to make sure that society is ready and able to take all of us and all abilities and make things work for people without putting the majority responsibility on them. And I think, Dr. Chandler, I shared with you DeVos' 2 articles on institutional ethnography pieces on the medical model and the social model. I'm happy to share them again if you want to share it with your students. Classism as well, absolutely.
Thank you, Rashmee. I'll just vocalize a few great comments. Julie writes, I feel like the students need to be involved. I was underestimated in high school. Once I understood how I retained information in college, I excelled. And Kelsey has written, even if it's not an intentional disinviting, excluding lots of factors can make it infeasible for parents to attend meetings, shift work, lack of interpreters, childcare, racism, homophobia, bigotry in the education system, etc. So thank you for those comments. And maybe just as a final question, unfortunately, we are nearing the end of our time, but Jackie Getfield had a question. She writes, if parents are positioned as partners, why wouldn't EAs and parents be invited to all meetings? What is the purpose of secret meetings with teachers, administrators, and therefore the silencing of some parents under the parental engagement policy? And I read Professor Getfield's question as less rhetorical, and I do wonder, what is the purpose? There must be a purpose to that. So, as a final, as a sort of concluding thought, Rashmee, anything you want to address to any of those comments would be fantastic.
To Jackie Getfield's comment about if parents are positioned as partners, and what is the purpose of secret meetings with teachers and silencing of some parents under the parental engagement policy. Once again, as an institutional ethnographer, I see the gap between the textual and the actual, right? Because the textual is what is written, and how the actual occurs is based on who is taking it up. And site-based issues are those that are the most troubling ones based on Jackie's comment here. So those are the issues that need to be taken up at the local site. And here's the thing, if it's written in policy, then there is enough room for things to work out. You know, if it's written, that textual needs to translate into the actual. And the criticality of it is, well, if we have asked 5 times and we've asked 50 times, you know, that 51st time is still us asking, you know, then it's not true inclusion if we are waiting for people to ask. You see, so those are local worksite issues that need to be taken up at the local worksite, of course, within the, once again, conversations that you have in your school. And that is why it's the work, right? It's the everyday work. The mothering for schooling is work. And it's just now, during the time of the global pandemic, that it's becoming more visible for people who had not seen it before. But those who were experiencing it and doing it always knew that these inequities existed long before 2020. Those of us who worked in community knew that these issues were always there. It is not a new phenomenon, but it's one loose thread, you know, that's causing things to unravel rather fast, because the image of education of particular places is very high based on the textual, you know, which is what brought me here. And that's why the personal is political, right? So it's like the streets of London are not paved with gold. You realize when you go there. And that is what happens in the disjuncture of it, which is why we show up and we build those connections and we do that research and we bring that research back to community. And this is not it yet, because I still have to go to my multilingual mothers and talk to them about it, right? In the languages in which we tell our stories and in which we laugh. That work is yet to be done.
Thank you so much. We're nearing the end of our talk. Unfortunately, I'll just read out a couple more comments. One from Amanda, who says, I think the change needs to start in the representation of EAs. You mentioned a teacher would need to invite us to the meeting, but when EAs are understood by the majority in power, such as school boards and principals, as helpers, we are then treated by teachers and parents as just helpers, and therefore not included as professionals with insight and experience. And there were a lot of support for that comment. Sheila Jennings writes, an EA at the table, might it be regarding an EA at the EAs at the table, might it possibly reflect that children with disabilities are not fully welcome in school? I had that sense as a mother back in 2002 here in Toronto. As a lawyer mother, I often felt I was combating that. And that's a really interesting point as well.
Yes.
I think, unfortunately, I see that we're out of time, and Roman has been interpreting by himself because Debbie had a power outage, our second interpreter. So I feel it's very important to end on time. But Dr. Rashmee Karnad-Jani, I really want to thank you for starting this conversation. I think by the comments and by the excellent research that you're presenting tonight, I have every indication that this will be the start of something really important between you, your work, and the school. Thank you to the students for all of your comments. From your place of knowledge as EAs and parents, it's been fantastic to see all of these accumulating comments. I do have to say a special thank you to the students of GSD 613 for such an amazing term together, an amazing 12 weeks together and wish you the best of luck on your upcoming exam. And please stay in touch with us. And thank you, of course, to Roman for interpreting and for AI Media for the captioning. And a final thank you to FCS and the School of Disability Studies for funding this event. And thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. Okay, it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Dorothy Smith for introducing me to institutional ethnography. And thank you for attending this talk.
Thank you.